In the criminal world, debts rarely disappear. They grow, they evolve, and when money can no longer repay them, something far more personal is demanded in return. For Clara Bennett, that brutal truth arrived on a quiet evening in New York City, the moment her life stopped belonging to her. Manhattan glowed beneath the fading light of sunset as traffic crawled through the busy avenues. Inside a modest apartment overlooking a crowded street, Clara Bennett stood near the kitchen window, watching the city move. At 23 years old, Clara had spent most of her life trying to escape the shadow of the world her father lived in. Daniel Bennett had always called himself a businessman, but Clara knew better. She had grown up watching men in expensive suits arrive at their home late at night. Their conversations always happened behind closed doors. Their voices were low, careful, and filled with the kind of tension that only existed when money and power were involved. As Clara grew older, the truth became harder to ignore. Her father's business deals were not legitimate. They were tied to the criminal networks that quietly operated beneath the surface of New York's financial system. Despite that reality, Clara had always tried to keep her distance. She studied hard in school, earned a scholarship to a small university, and focused on building a future far away from the dangerous world surrounding her family. Her dream was simple: freedom. Freedom from the debts, secrets, and dangerous alliances that controlled her father's life for years. But that evening, Clara sensed something was wrong the moment Daniel Bennett walked through the apartment door. Her father looked older than usual. His normally confident posture had been replaced by a heavy tension that followed him into the room. Clara watched as he poured himself a drink without speaking. "You're home early," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, but did not answer immediately. For several seconds, he simply stared at the glass in his hand. Clara had seen that expression before. It was a look her father wore when a deal had gone terribly wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Daniel finally looked at her. His eyes carried a weight Clara had never seen before. "I made a mistake." The words landed heavily in the quiet apartment. Daniel Bennett had never been a man who admitted mistakes easily. Clara felt a knot tighten in her chest. "What kind of mistake?" Daniel hesitated. Then he sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "Do you remember the investors I've been working with this year?" Clara nodded. She remembered the late-night meetings and whispered conversations that seemed more secretive than usual. "They offered me an opportunity," Daniel continued, "a chance to multiply our money through a series of financial trades." Clara already knew where the story was going. "You gambled." Daniel did not deny it. "I believed the market would shift in our favor, but it didn't." Daniel looked down at the table. "No." The silence between them stretched painfully. Clara's voice dropped slightly. "How much?" Daniel's answer came quietly. $20 million. Clara felt the room tilt around her. 20 million. The number was impossible to comprehend. Her father had always operated in risky financial circles, but nothing had ever been this large. "Who do you owe?" she asked. Daniel did not answer right away. But Clara already knew the truth would be worse than the number itself. Finally he spoke. "Adrian Varela." The name froze the air in the room. Even people far removed from organized crime had heard stories about Adrian Varela. He was rumored to control one of the largest criminal empires in the country: shipping companies, financial networks, private security firms. Every industry connected to underground trade seemed to lead back to him. But what truly made Adrian Varela feared was not his wealth. It was his reputation. Men who crossed him rarely had a second chance. Clara felt her pulse begin to race. "You borrowed money from Adrian Varela?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I lost money that belonged to him." The distinction made the situation even worse. Borrowing money meant negotiations were possible. Losing money meant punishment. Clara moved slowly to the chair across from him. "What happens now?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "He gave me 1 week." "For what?" "To repay the debt." Clara stared at him. "You don't have that kind of money." Daniel's silence answered the question. Clara's thoughts began racing. "What about selling assets?" "I've already tried." "Loans?" "No bank will touch something like this." Clara felt the panic growing inside her chest. If Adrian Varela expected repayment and Daniel could not provide it, the consequences would be devastating. "What does he do to people who can't pay?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked away. The answer was something he could not bring himself to say out loud. The next 3 days passed in a blur of tension and fear. Daniel spent every hour searching for a solution that did not exist. Clara watched helplessly as phone calls ended in rejection, and every possible financial option collapsed. By the 4th day, Daniel Bennett understood the truth. The debt would never be repaid with money. So he arranged a meeting. The location was a private penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, the kind of place where powerful men discussed dangerous decisions far away from public attention. Clara did not know about the meeting until the moment Daniel asked her to come with him. The request felt strange immediately, but when they arrived at the penthouse and the doors opened, the truth revealed itself instantly. Several men stood inside the room, all of them silent, all of them watching, and at the center of the room stood Adrian Varela. He looked exactly like the stories described. Tall, calm, dressed in a dark suit that matched the cold authority in his posture. The moment Clara saw him, she understood why powerful men feared this person. Adrian Varela did not need to raise his voice to control a room. His presence alone was enough. Daniel stepped forward slowly. His voice carried tension. "I wasn't able to recover the money." Adrian listened quietly. Then he spoke. "And yet you asked for this meeting." Daniel nodded. "I came with another offer." Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. "What kind of offer?" Daniel hesitated. Clara suddenly felt a strange unease forming inside her chest. Something about the way her father looked at her made the room feel colder. Then Daniel spoke the words that shattered everything she believed about her life. "She will repay the debt." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Adrian's eyes shifted toward her for the first time. Daniel continued, "My daughter." The silence in the room deepened. Clara felt her entire world collapse in a single moment. Her own father had just turned her into payment for a criminal debt. Adrian studied her carefully. His gaze was calm, analytical, as if evaluating the value of something that had just been placed in front of him. Finally he spoke. "You're offering your daughter to settle $20 million. Daniel nodded slowly. Clara stood frozen beside him, unable to believe what she was hearing. But Daniel was not finished. "She will marry you." The words echoed through the room like a verdict. Clara's future had just been sold. But Adrian Varela did not yet know the most dangerous truth hidden beneath that arrangement, because the woman standing in front of him was already carrying a secret that could change everything. Clara Bennett was pregnant, and the child growing inside her belonged to Adrian Varela himself. Power in the criminal world rarely depended on how loudly a man spoke. True power appeared in quieter ways, in the way entire rooms fell silent when someone entered, in the way powerful men chose their words more carefully when a certain name was mentioned. Across the underground networks that stretched from New York to Los Angeles, one name carried that kind of weight: Adrian Varela. For more than a decade, Adrian had built an empire that extended far beyond the reach of ordinary organized crime. His influence stretched through international shipping routes, financial institutions that quietly moved untraceable money, and private security networks that operated across multiple countries. Officially, Adrian Varela was a global logistics entrepreneur. Unofficially, he was the man who controlled one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in the United States. But what made him truly feared was not the scale of his empire. It was the way he ran it. Adrian Varela was not impulsive. He did not act out of anger. Every decision he made was calculated with surgical precision. Enemies who betrayed him rarely faced dramatic punishments. Instead, they simply disappeared. Their companies collapsed. Their financial networks vanished. And their allies quietly abandoned them. By the time anyone realized what happened, Adrian Varela had already erased them from the system entirely. That reputation followed him everywhere. Even the men who worked beside him treated his authority with absolute respect. Inside the penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, that same silent authority filled the room. Clara Bennett stood beside her father, still struggling to understand the words Daniel Bennett had spoken moments earlier. Her own father had offered her as repayment for his debt. The realization felt unreal. But the calm expression on Adrian Varela's face confirmed something terrifying. He was seriously considering the offer. Adrian remained near the tall windows overlooking the river, his attention focused entirely on Clara. He studied her carefully, not with cruelty, not with obvious judgment, but with the cold precision of someone evaluating a decision that could affect far more than the people standing in front of him. Daniel Bennett waited nervously for a response. His entire future now depended on the man standing across the room. Adrian spoke slowly. "You believe your daughter is worth $20 million. Daniel nodded cautiously. "She is intelligent, educated, loyal." Clara felt a wave of disbelief. The words sounded less like a father describing his daughter and more like a businessman presenting an asset. Adrian's gaze remained fixed on Clara. "What do you think about this arrangement?" The question surprised her. For a moment, Clara almost believed Adrian actually cared about her answer, but she quickly realized the truth. This was not about her opinion. It was about control. Still, Clara forced herself to remain calm. She understood something important in that moment. Fear would only make her look weaker, and weakness in Adrian Varela's world was dangerous. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that debts should be paid by the people who create them." A faint shift appeared in Adrian's expression. Not anger. Interest. Daniel looked horrified. "That's not what she meant," he quickly said. But Adrian raised his hand slightly. The room fell silent again. "Continue." Clara felt the weight of Adrian's attention. Her mind raced through every possible consequence of what she might say next. But she also knew something else. Her life had already been taken from her the moment her father made his offer, which meant honesty was the only power she had left. "You lost money," Clara said calmly, looking directly at Adrian. "My father lost your money." "Yes," Adrian replied, "but I didn't." Adrian studied her more closely now. The calm confidence in her voice did not match the fear he expected from someone placed in this situation. Victor Calderon, Adrian's longtime advisor, standing near the wall, noticed the same thing. Clara Bennett was not reacting like someone completely broken by the circumstances. She was reacting like someone thinking. That alone made Adrian curious. Adrian finally stepped away from the window and moved closer. Clara forced herself not to step back. Standing only a few feet away from him, she could feel the quiet authority he carried. Adrian spoke again. "Your father's debt must still be paid." Clara nodded slightly. "I understand that. And you are willing to take responsibility for it?" Clara hesitated. Responsibility was not the right word. Sacrifice was, but she did not correct him. Instead, she said quietly, "If there is no other option." Daniel watched the exchange with growing relief. It seemed like Adrian might actually accept the arrangement, but Adrian Varela never rushed decisions. He turned his attention toward Victor. "What do we know about her?" Victor opened a small tablet, displaying Clara's background information. Clara Bennett, 23, finance student at Columbia University. Victor scrolled through the report. Excellent academic record. No criminal history. No financial debt. Adrian nodded slowly. The information confirmed something he had already suspected. Clara Bennett had spent her entire life trying to stay away from the world her father operated in, which made Daniel Bennett's offer even more interesting. Daniel had not simply offered his daughter as repayment. He had offered the one person who clearly did not belong in this world. Adrian turned back to Clara. "Marriage would settle your father's debt permanently." The statement sounded almost casual, but Clara understood its real meaning. Her entire future was now a transaction, a legal arrangement designed to secure Adrian's power over Daniel Bennett, and there was nothing romantic about it. Adrian continued, "You would live under my protection." Protection. The word sounded generous, but Clara knew the truth. Protection in Adrian Varela's world meant ownership. She would belong to him. Her freedom would disappear the moment she accepted. Clara lowered her gaze briefly. Inside her mind, another fear grew louder. The secret she carried. The secret Adrian could never discover. Because the truth would change everything. The child growing inside her belonged to Adrian himself. A mistake from months earlier. A brief encounter that had happened long before Clara understood who Adrian Varela truly was. If he discovered the truth now, the consequences could be unpredictable. He might see it as manipulation, or betrayal, or something far worse. Clara forced herself to stay calm. Adrian was still watching her carefully. "Do you accept the arrangement?" he asked. Clara looked up slowly. Her voice remained steady. "Yes." Daniel released a quiet breath of relief. The debt was settled. His life was saved. But Adrian was not finished. He stepped closer, studying Clara with a new intensity. His instincts, sharpened by years of reading people, had noticed something unusual. Clara's posture was controlled. Her voice was steady. But beneath that calm exterior, something about her behavior felt guarded, as if she were protecting something important. Adrian spoke again. "You're hiding something." The words landed like a blade cutting through the silence. Clara felt her heart stop for a single terrifying moment, because Adrian Varela had just begun asking the one question she could never allow him to answer. Power in the criminal world rarely depended on how loudly a man spoke. True power appeared in quieter ways, in the way entire rooms fell silent when someone entered, in the way powerful men chose their words more carefully when a certain name was mentioned. Across the underground networks that stretched from New York to Los Angeles, one name carried that kind of weight: Adrian Varela. For more than a decade, Adrian had built an empire that extended far beyond the reach of ordinary organized crime. His influence stretched through international shipping routes, financial institutions that quietly moved untraceable money, and private security networks that operated across multiple countries. Officially, Adrian Varela was a global logistics entrepreneur. Unofficially, he was the man who controlled one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in the United States. But what made him truly feared was not the scale of his empire. It was the way he ran it. Adrian Varela was not impulsive. He did not act out of anger. Every decision he made was calculated with surgical precision. Enemies who betrayed him rarely faced dramatic punishments. Instead, they simply disappeared. Their companies collapsed. Their financial networks vanished. And their allies quietly abandoned them. By the time anyone realized what happened, Adrian Varela had already erased them from the system entirely. That reputation followed him everywhere. Even the men who worked beside him treated his authority with absolute respect. Inside the penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, that same silent authority filled the room. Clara Bennett stood beside her father, still struggling to understand the words Daniel Bennett had spoken moments earlier. Her own father had offered her as repayment for his debt. The realization felt unreal. But the calm expression on Adrian Varela's face confirmed something terrifying. He was seriously considering the offer. Adrian remained near the tall windows overlooking the river, his attention focused entirely on Clara. He studied her carefully, not with cruelty, not with obvious judgment, but with the cold precision of someone evaluating a decision that could affect far more than the people standing in front of him. Daniel Bennett waited nervously for a response. His entire future now depended on the man standing across the room. Adrian spoke slowly. "You believe your daughter is worth $20 million. Daniel nodded cautiously. "She is intelligent, educated, loyal." Clara felt a wave of disbelief. The words sounded less like a father describing his daughter and more like a businessman presenting an asset. Adrian's gaze remained fixed on Clara. "What do you think about this arrangement?" The question surprised her. For a moment, Clara almost believed Adrian actually cared about her answer, but she quickly realized the truth. This was not about her opinion. It was about control. Still, Clara forced herself to remain calm. She understood something important in that moment. Fear would only make her look weaker, and weakness in Adrian Varela's world was dangerous. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that debts should be paid by the people who create them." A faint shift appeared in Adrian's expression. Not anger. Interest. Daniel looked horrified. "That's not what she meant," he quickly said. But Adrian raised his hand slightly. The room fell silent again. "Continue." Clara felt the weight of Adrian's attention. Her mind raced through every possible consequence of what she might say next. But she also knew something else. Her life had already been taken from her the moment her father made his offer, which meant honesty was the only power she had left. "You lost money," Clara said calmly, looking directly at Adrian. "My father lost your money." "Yes," Adrian replied, "but I didn't." Adrian studied her more closely now. The calm confidence in her voice did not match the fear he expected from someone placed in this situation. Victor Calderon, Adrian's longtime advisor, standing near the wall, noticed the same thing. Clara Bennett was not reacting like someone completely broken by the circumstances. She was reacting like someone thinking. That alone made Adrian curious. Adrian finally stepped away from the window and moved closer. Clara forced herself not to step back. Standing only a few feet away from him, she could feel the quiet authority he carried. Adrian spoke again. "Your father's debt must still be paid." Clara nodded slightly. "I understand that. And you are willing to take responsibility for it?" Clara hesitated. Responsibility was not the right word. Sacrifice was, but she did not correct him. Instead, she said quietly, "If there is no other option." Daniel watched the exchange with growing relief. It seemed like Adrian might actually accept the arrangement, but Adrian Varela never rushed decisions. He turned his attention toward Victor. "What do we know about her?" Victor opened a small tablet, displaying Clara's background information. Clara Bennett, 23, finance student at Columbia University. Victor scrolled through the report. Excellent academic record. No criminal history. No financial debt. Adrian nodded slowly. The information confirmed something he had already suspected. Clara Bennett had spent her entire life trying to stay away from the world her father operated in, which made Daniel Bennett's offer even more interesting. Daniel had not simply offered his daughter as repayment. He had offered the one person who clearly did not belong in this world. Adrian turned back to Clara. "Marriage would settle your father's debt permanently." The statement sounded almost casual, but Clara understood its real meaning. Her entire future was now a transaction, a legal arrangement designed to secure Adrian's power over Daniel Bennett, and there was nothing romantic about it. Adrian continued, "You would live under my protection." Protection. The word sounded generous, but Clara knew the truth. Protection in Adrian Varela's world meant ownership. She would belong to him. Her freedom would disappear the moment she accepted. Clara lowered her gaze briefly. Inside her mind, another fear grew louder. The secret she carried. The secret Adrian could never discover. Because the truth would change everything. The child growing inside her belonged to Adrian himself. A mistake from months earlier. A brief encounter that had happened long before Clara understood who Adrian Varela truly was. If he discovered the truth now, the consequences could be unpredictable. He might see it as manipulation, or betrayal, or something far worse. Clara forced herself to stay calm. Adrian was still watching her carefully. "Do you accept the arrangement?" he asked. Clara looked up slowly. Her voice remained steady. "Yes." Daniel released a quiet breath of relief. The debt was settled. His life was saved. But Adrian was not finished. He stepped closer, studying Clara with a new intensity. His instincts, sharpened by years of reading people, had noticed something unusual. Clara's posture was controlled. Her voice was steady. But beneath that calm exterior, something about her behavior felt guarded, as if she were protecting something important. Adrian spoke again. "You're hiding something." The words landed like a blade cutting through the silence. Clara felt her heart stop for a single terrifying moment, because Adrian Varela had just begun asking the one question she could never allow him to answer. Power does not always reveal itself through violence. Sometimes it hides behind silence, behind quiet hallways, guarded gates, and the subtle obedience of people who understand exactly who holds control. Clara Bennett realized at the moment the iron gates of Adrian Varela's estate closed behind the black car, carrying her away from Manhattan. The drive had taken nearly 40 minutes, leaving the noise of the city behind, as the road wound through a quiet stretch of forested land north of the Hudson River. Tall trees surrounded the property, forming a natural barrier that shielded the estate from curious eyes. At the end of the long private road stood Adrian Varela's mansion. Even from a distance, The estate looked less like a home and more like a private fortress. Tall stone walls surrounded the outer grounds. Security towers monitored every corner of the property. Cameras followed the approaching vehicle long before it reached the main gate. When the car stopped in front of the massive entrance, Clara finally understood something important. This was not simply where Adrian Varela lived. It was where he ruled. The mansion itself was enormous. 3 stories of modern architecture built with dark stone and glass that reflected the surrounding forest. Long balconies overlooked carefully maintained gardens, while private garages stretched across the side of the property. But what stood out most was the quiet discipline of the people working there. Armed guards stood at every entrance. Security teams communicated through earpieces as the car arrived. Even the staff members waiting near the front steps carried themselves with careful precision. Every movement on the property had a purpose. The car door opened. One of Adrian's security advisors stepped aside respectfully as Clara stepped out onto the stone driveway. The cold evening air carried the faint scent of pine from the surrounding forest. For a moment, Clara simply stood there staring at the mansion. This was where her life would now unfold. Adrian stepped out of the car beside her. Without looking back, he began walking toward the entrance. Clara followed. Inside, the mansion revealed even more of Adrian's world. The main hall stretched across a wide marble floor, illuminated by soft golden lighting. A sweeping staircase curved upward toward the second level, while several hallways extended into different wings of the estate. Expensive artwork decorated the walls. But Clara noticed something else immediately. Security. Hidden cameras monitored the corridors. Private security personnel stood near key intersections of the hall. Nothing inside the mansion existed without purpose. Victor Calderon approached from across the hall. His calm expression suggested he had already anticipated Adrian's arrival. "Everything is prepared," Victor said. Adrian nodded. "Good." Victor's gaze briefly shifted toward Clara before returning to Adrian. "I'll update you on the situation later tonight." Adrian turned toward the staircase. After dinner, Victor nodded and left without further questions. Clara watched the exchange carefully. It was clear Victor held an important position inside Adrian's organization. But what stood out more was the way he spoke to Adrian. Respectful, controlled, but never nervous, which meant Adrian trusted him. Adrian finally looked back at Clara. "You'll have your own suite." He gestured toward the second floor. "This way." The rooms upstairs were even larger than Clara expected. The suite Adrian assigned to her overlooked the forest behind the mansion. Tall windows allowed sunlight to flood the space during the day, while elegant furniture filled the sitting area and bedroom. Everything about the room suggested comfort, but Clara knew the truth. Comfort and freedom were not the same thing. When the staff member left after showing her the room, Clara sat quietly near the window. The silence of forest outside felt strangely peaceful compared to the chaos that had brought her here. For the first time since the wedding, Clara allowed herself a moment to breathe, but her hand moved instinctively to her stomach again. The secret she carried remained the most dangerous part of her life. Every day she spent in Adrian Varela's mansion increased the chance that someone might notice the truth. And if Adrian discovered the pregnancy before she was ready to explain, the thought sent a cold wave through her chest. Over the next several days, Clara slowly began observing the rhythm of life inside the mansion. Adrian's empire operated constantly. Meetings happened in the large conference room near the west wing of the house. Security advisors arrived throughout the day with reports from across the country. Financial analysts reviewed complex transactions connected to Adrian's shipping companies. From the outside, it looked like the headquarters of a global corporation. But Clara knew the truth. This was the center of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, and Adrian Varela stood at the top of it. Despite his reputation, Clara noticed something unexpected about the way he ran his empire. Adrian rarely raised his voice. He did not intimidate people through anger or threats. Instead, he listened carefully during meetings, allowing others to speak before making his decisions. When he finally did speak, the room always became silent, because everyone knew the final decision belonged to him. Clara watched several of those meetings from a distance. She noticed how Adrian studied every detail before acting. how he analyzed problems with calm patience instead of impulsive aggression. It was not the behavior she expected from someone known across the criminal world as ruthless. The realization confused her, because the man she observed inside the mansion did not look like the monster people feared. One evening, Clara stood near the balcony overlooking the gardens when Adrian joined her. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "You're observing everything." Clara glanced toward him. "Yes. You're trying to understand how this world works." Clara nodded slightly. Adrian studied her expression. "You expected something different." Clara hesitated before answering. "I expected cruelty." Adrian looked out across the dark forest. "Cruelty is inefficient." The answer surprised her, but before she could respond, Victor Calderon approached from the hallway behind them. His expression carried urgency. "Adrian." Adrian turned immediately. "What happened?" Victor handed him a tablet displaying several financial reports. Adrian studied the screen. His calm expression slowly hardened. "Who authorized these transfers?" Victor shook his head. "That's the problem. They came from inside our network." Clara felt the tension in the air immediately. Adrian continued scanning the financial data. Several transactions had moved large amounts of money through one of his shipping subsidiaries, but the accounts connected to those transfers did not belong to any company he controlled, which meant someone inside his organization had been secretly redirecting funds. Victor spoke quietly. "The pattern suggests this has been happening for months." Adrian looked up slowly. His eyes had changed. The calm strategist Clara had been observing over the past week was gone. In his place stood the man the criminal world feared, cold, focused, and already preparing to find whoever had betrayed him. Secrets are rarely dangerous because they exist. They become dangerous because they cannot remain hidden forever. For Clara Bennett, the truth she carried inside Adrian Varela's mansion was becoming heavier with each passing day, not only because of the child growing quietly inside her body, but because the world around her was beginning to change in ways she never expected. The discovery Adrian made that night about the suspicious financial transfers had already begun reshaping the atmosphere inside the mansion. The calm rhythm of Adrian's empire had shifted. Meetings became more frequent. Security teams moved through the halls with greater urgency. Victor Calderon and several of Adrian's senior advisors spent long hours inside the operations room, reviewing reports from across the organization. Something inside Adrian Varela's empire was broken, and everyone inside the mansion could feel it. Clara noticed the tension almost immediately. During breakfast the following morning, Adrian appeared at the long dining table earlier than usual. His expression remained calm, but his attention was focused elsewhere. Several documents rested beside his coffee: financial reports, shipment records, private intelligence briefings. Victor joined him minutes later, carrying a digital tablet filled with additional information. Clara watched the quiet exchange between them from across the table. "What did you find?" Adrian asked. Victor placed the tablet beside the documents. "The transfers originate from one of our Eastern shipping divisions." Adrian studied the numbers carefully. "How much?" Victor answered without hesitation. "Over $12 million moved through shell accounts during the past 6 months." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "That kind of movement requires authorization." Victor nodded, "which means someone inside the organization approved it." The implication hung in the air between them. Betrayal. Inside Adrian Varela's empire, loyalty was not optional, and anyone who violated that loyalty rarely remained alive long enough to explain why. Clara remained silent while the two men continued analyzing the reports. But something about the financial patterns on the screen caught her attention. She had spent years studying finance during her university education. Numbers often revealed truths people tried to hide, and the pattern inside Adrian's reports looked strangely familiar. Without thinking, Clara spoke. "The transfers follow a cycle." Both men turned toward her. Victor raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you mean?" Clara hesitated briefly before standing and walking closer to the table. She studied the transaction records more carefully. "These payments move every 3 weeks," she said quietly. Victor checked the dates again. She was right. Most laundering systems use irregular transfers, Clara continued. But this pattern is too consistent. Adrian watched her closely now. Why would someone do that? Clara pointed to another section of the report. The money isn't disappearing. Victor leaned forward. What do you mean? Clara opened one of the attached documents, showing international shipping routes. These accounts connect to companies that operate along the same port authority. Victor's expression changed slightly. Baltimore. Clara nodded. Yes. Adrian studied the data again. If Clara was correct, the money had not simply been stolen. It had been redirected into another logistics network, which meant someone inside his empire was secretly building a second financial structure beneath his own. Victor looked toward Adrian. That kind of operation would take months to organize. Adrian nodded slowly. And someone with authority to move funds without triggering internal alarms. Silence filled the room. Clara suddenly realized she had stepped deeper into Adrian's world than she intended. Her insight had just confirmed something dangerous. Someone powerful inside Adrian's organization had been quietly preparing to betray him. Victor studied Clara carefully. You notice that quickly. Clara shrugged slightly. It's basic financial analysis. Adrian remained silent, but inside his mind, something had shifted. Clara Bennett had just recognized a pattern that several of his financial analysts had missed. That kind of intelligence was not common. Over the next several days, Clara found herself drawn further into the investigation than she ever expected. Adrian began asking for her opinion during private strategy meetings. At first, it was simple questions, observations about transaction patterns, possible explanations for suspicious activity. But gradually the discussions became more complex. Clara helped analyze shipment routes connected to the stolen funds. She compared financial records from multiple subsidiaries. And slowly, the outline of conspiracy inside Adrian's empire began to appear. Someone had been secretly redirecting money from Adrian's shipping operations into a rival logistics network along the eastern coast. A network that could eventually compete with Adrian's own empire. Victor finally summarized the situation during one late-night meeting. If this operation continues unchecked, the rival network could control several key ports within a year. Adrian stood near the large digital map displayed across the wall. That won't happen. Clara watched him carefully. The calm authority he carried during moments like this was impossible to ignore. Adrian did not panic. He did not shout. He simply studied the problem until the solution became clear. And slowly, Clara began realizing something she never expected. The man she had feared most in the world was not the monster she imagined. Yes, Adrian ruled a dangerous empire. Yes, he made ruthless decisions when necessary. But he also carried the burden of protecting everything built beneath that empire. Thousands of people depended on the stability of the network he controlled. Shipping companies, financial systems, entire supply chains that quietly operated behind legitimate businesses. Adrian Varela was not simply a crime boss. He was a strategist responsible for maintaining an invisible structure most people never even noticed. And somehow, Clara had become part of that structure. But the secret inside her continued growing more dangerous every day. Her pregnancy remained hidden beneath loose clothing and careful posture. But time was working against her. Soon the physical signs would become impossible to hide. Every meeting she attended, every moment she spent near Adrian, carried the risk that he might discover the truth before she was ready. One afternoon, Clara stepped into the mansion's private library to review several financial reports Adrian had left for her. The quiet room offered a rare moment of solitude. But as she studied the documents, the sudden sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. Victor Calderon entered the room. His sharp eyes immediately noticed the report spread across the table. You're helping him analyze the financial records. Clara nodded slowly. Victor approached closer. His reputation as Adrian's most trusted advisor meant he rarely missed important details. And today his attention seemed focused entirely on her. You've been involved in every meeting this week. Clara felt a subtle tension in his tone. I'm only offering suggestions. Victor studied her carefully. Adrian values those suggestions. Clara said nothing. Victor walked slowly around the table. Then he stopped beside her. His eyes narrowed slightly. Are you feeling unwell? The question struck Clara like a sudden shock. Victor's gaze had dropped briefly toward her stomach. For a terrifying moment, Clara felt certain her secret had just been exposed. Because Adrian's most observant advisor was now beginning to notice something she had worked desperately to hide. Betrayal inside a powerful empire rarely stays hidden for long. Once the first crack appears, the entire structure begins to shift. For Adrian Varela, the discovery of secret financial transfers inside his organization was not just a sign of corruption. It was the first signal of war. The moment Victor Calderon began investigating the suspicious transactions Clara had identified, the truth started unfolding quickly. Someone inside Adrian's empire had not only been redirecting money, they had been preparing the foundation for a rival network powerful enough to challenge Adrian's control over several critical shipping routes along the East Coast. And that kind of operation could not exist without protection. Protection meant allies. Allies meant enemies. The first attack came 3 nights later. One of Adrian's cargo terminals in New Jersey reported a sudden armed takeover shortly after midnight. Security cameras captured a group of masked men forcing their way into the dockyard and seizing control of a shipment scheduled to leave before dawn. By the time Adrian's security teams arrived, the attackers had already vanished. The cargo was gone. The message was clear. Whoever was responsible for betrayal had decided to stop hiding. Inside Adrian's mansion, the atmosphere changed overnight. The quiet halls that once carried a calm rhythm of operations now moved with urgency. Security teams doubled their patrols. Advisors arrived throughout the day, carrying reports from across Adrian's network. Large digital maps filled the operations room walls, displaying shipping routes, financial systems, and intelligence updates from dozens of locations. Clara Bennett stood quietly near the main conference table as Victor reviewed the latest reports. 3 more shipments were intercepted this morning, Victor said. Adrian studied the map displayed on the wall. The red markers showing compromised routes were beginning to form a pattern. They're targeting the eastern corridor, Adrian said calmly. Victor nodded. New Jersey, Baltimore, Savannah. Clara stepped closer to the screen. Her eyes followed the pattern of attacks across the map. The strategy immediately caught her attention. They're isolating your supply chain. Victor glanced toward her. Explain. Clara pointed to the red markers. These ports connect the majority of your financial shipments. If they control this route, they can weaken your entire logistics network. Adrian looked at her thoughtfully. You're suggesting this isn't random. Clara shook her head. No, this is coordinated. Victor folded his arms. That means whoever is behind the conspiracy already has a second shipping network prepared. Adrian nodded slowly, which confirmed his earlier suspicion. The betrayal inside his organization had not simply been about stealing money. It had been about building an alternative empire beneath his own. Victor opened another intelligence report. We've identified the leader of the rival operation. Adrian looked toward the screen. A name appeared beside the financial records. Marcus Serrano. The room fell silent for a moment. Adrian recognized the name immediately. Marcus Serrano had once controlled a major smuggling network along the eastern seaboard before Adrian forced him out of several key ports nearly 7 years earlier. Most people believe Serrano's empire had collapsed completely after that defeat, but the financial records Clara discovered suggested something very different. Serrano had not disappeared. He had simply been rebuilding in secret. Clara studied the information carefully. If Serrano has been funding these operations for months, he must have allies inside your network. Victor nodded. We're already investigating. Adrian remained calm, but Clara noticed a subtle shift in his posture. He had moved beyond suspicion. Now, he was calculating strategy. And the man the criminal world feared most always became more dangerous when strategy replaced uncertainty. Over the following week, the conflict between the two empires escalated rapidly. More shipments were attacked. Several companies connected to Adrian's logistics network reported sudden financial disruptions. Private security teams loyal to Serrano attempted to intimidate Adrian's business partners. The war that had once existed quietly beneath the surface was now beginning to show itself openly. But Adrian did not respond with chaos. He responded with precision. New security teams were deployed across vulnerable ports. Financial analysts began tracing the money flowing through Serrano's network. Several companies secretly connected to Serrano suddenly found their banking accounts frozen. Every move Serrano made was answered with one of Adrian's own. And through it all, Clara remained involved in the strategy discussions. At first, she believed Adrian simply valued her financial insight, but gradually something deeper began to form. Trust. Adrian started asking for her opinion before making decisions about shipping routes and financial countermeasures. Victor noticed it too. During one late-night strategy session, he glanced toward Clara with a faint smile. "You become part of the command structure." Clara shook her head slightly. "I'm just helping." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what Adrian values." Clara looked across the table at Adrian. He was studying several intelligence reports with the same quiet focus she had come to recognize. Despite the violence erupting across his empire, Adrian never appeared overwhelmed. He simply adapted, and in ways Clara had never expected. She found herself admiring the way he carried that responsibility. Because every decision Adrian made affected hundreds of people working inside the system he controlled. The weight of that responsibility was something few people could handle, yet Adrian carried it calmly. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Clara realized she no longer saw him as the cruel man her father had warned her about. She saw something more complicated, a leader fighting to protect the empire he had built. But as the investigation into Serrano's conspiracy deepened, another discovery began to emerge. Victor approached Adrian one evening, holding a new intelligence report. His expression was unusually serious. "We traced the financial transfers that started this entire operation." Adrian looked up. "Where did they originate?" Victor placed the report on the table. "A consulting firm in Manhattan." Clara's breath caught quietly in her chest. Victor continued. "The company processed the first set of laundering transactions that funded Serrano's network." Adrian read the company name printed across the report. Then his eyes slowly lifted toward Clara. Because a consulting firm connected to Serrano's conspiracy had one very familiar connection. It was the same company where Clara Bennett had once worked alongside her father. Some secrets survive because people choose not to see them. Others survive only until a moment truth becomes impossible to ignore. For Clara Bennett, that moment arrived sooner than she had hoped. The investigation into betrayal inside Adrian Varela's empire had reached a dangerous turning point. The discovery that the financial network supporting Marcus Serrano's operation traced back to the Manhattan consulting firm where Clara once worked had already changed the atmosphere inside the mansion. The connection to her past could no longer be ignored, and neither could the secret she had carried since the day she first met Adrian. For weeks, Clara had carefully hidden the physical signs of her pregnancy. Loose clothing, avoiding unnecessary attention, carefully choosing when to appear during meetings. But time had a way of revealing truths no amount of caution could hide forever. The changes in her body were becoming harder to conceal. Victor Calderon had already noticed something unusual, and if Adrian Varela noticed as well, the consequences could be impossible to predict. The moment came during a late evening strategy meeting inside the mansion's operations room. The large digital maps covering the walls displayed updates from across Adrian's empire. Several of Serrano's financial networks had already collapsed after Adrian's countermeasures disrupted their banking channels. But the conflict was far from over. Victor stood near the table, reviewing intelligence reports from the eastern ports. "Serrano's remaining forces are regrouping in Baltimore," he said. Adrian studied the map calmly. "He'll make his final move soon." Clara stood beside the table examining another set of financial records connected to the consulting firm in Manhattan. The information revealed something deeply troubling. Someone inside that company had deliberately helped move Serrano's funding through legitimate accounts. Someone who understood exactly how Adrian's financial system operated, which meant the conspiracy was even closer to her past than she feared. As Clara leaned forward to place another report on the table, a sudden wave of dizziness passed through her body. Her hand moved instinctively to steady herself against the edge of the desk. The movement was small, but it was enough. Adrian noticed immediately. His sharp eyes rarely missed changes in behavior. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Clara straightened quickly. I'm fine. But Victor was already watching her carefully. His instincts, trained by years of working beside Adrian, were equally difficult to deceive. You've seemed unwell several times this week, Victor said. Clara tried to dismiss the concern. It's just stress. Victor stepped closer. Stress doesn't usually affect someone like this. Adrian's attention shifted between them. Something in Victor's tone had triggered his own suspicions. Clara, Adrian said calmly, look at me. She hesitated, but eventually she raised her eyes. Adrian studied her face carefully. There was a tension in her expression he had noticed before, a guarded fear that appeared whenever conversations moved too close to personal matters. His voice remained quiet. You've been hiding something since the day we met. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. The moment she had tried to delay for weeks had finally arrived. Victor glanced between them, sensing the shift in the room. Adrian spoke again. What is it? Clara looked away briefly. Her thoughts raced through every possible consequence. If Adrian believed she had intentionally deceived him, if he believed the child was some form of manipulation, the outcome could destroy everything. But hiding the truth was no longer possible. Her voice came quietly. There's something you deserve to know. Adrian said nothing. He simply waited. Clara slowly placed her hand against her stomach. The small gesture spoke louder than words. For a moment the room fell completely silent. Victor understood instantly. His eyes widened slightly as the meaning became clear. Adrian's expression did not change at first, but the intensity of his gaze sharpened. You're pregnant. Clara nodded slowly. Yes. The word hung in the air between them. Adrian stepped back slightly. His mind moved quickly through the possibilities. The marriage had only happened weeks earlier, which meant the pregnancy existed long before the arrangement her father had proposed. His voice dropped lower. How long? Clara answered honestly. 3 months. Victor quietly left the room, understanding this conversation was no longer his place to witness. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Clara and Adrian alone with a truth that could destroy everything. Adrian remained silent for several seconds. Then he spoke again. Who is the father? The question carried controlled tension. Clara finally met his gaze. You are. For the first time since she had known him, Adrian Varela looked genuinely stunned. Memories surfaced instantly in his mind. A brief encounter months earlier, a private charity event in Manhattan, where their paths had crossed unexpectedly. At the time, neither of them had known how deeply their lives would become connected. Adrian exhaled slowly. You knew. Clara nodded. Yes. And you said nothing. I was afraid. Adrian's expression darkened slightly. Afraid of me? Clara's answer came without hesitation. Yes. The honesty in her voice carried no accusation, only truth. For several seconds, Adrian said nothing. Then he walked slowly toward the window overlooking the dark forest beyond the mansion grounds. Clara watched him carefully. This was the moment that would decide everything. Anger, betrayal, rejection. Any of those reactions would be understandable. But when Adrian finally spoke again, his voice carried something unexpected. Understanding. You believed I would destroy your life if I knew. Clara swallowed. Yes. Adrian turned back toward her. But you stayed. Clara nodded slowly. I stayed because the war against Serrano affects more than just your empire. Adrian studied her carefully. And because of the child. Clara's hand rested gently against her stomach again. Yes. The silence between them softened slightly. In that moment, Adrian realized something he had not expected. The woman standing in front of him was no longer simply the daughter of a man who owed him money. She was a person who had helped uncover the betrayal threatening his empire, the person whose insight had changed the entire strategy of the war. And now she carried his child. Adrian finally spoke again. You should have told me. Clara nodded. I know, but you didn't. I needed to know who you really were first. Adrian looked at her thoughtfully. And now, Clara answered quietly, now I know you're not the man the world believes you are. The words carried more weight than she realized, because in that moment Adrian understood something important. Clara Bennett had become far more than an obligation forced upon him through a debt. She had become someone he could trust, and trust was the rarest currency in his world. Adrian turned toward the operations table again. The digital map still displayed Serrano's remaining strongholds along the eastern coast. The war was not finished yet, but now his reasons for ending had become even more personal. Adrian's voice returned to its calm authority. This ends now. Clara looked at him. What do you mean? Adrian reached for the secure phone, resting on the table. I'm preparing the final move. His eyes met hers once more. Because no one threatens my empire. A brief pause followed. Then his voice lowered slightly. And no one threatens my family. Powerful men often believe their lives are already written. Every decision calculated. Every outcome predicted. But sometimes a single unexpected person enters that world and quietly changes everything. For Adrian Varela, that person was Clara Bennett. The war that had begun with hidden financial transfers and silent betrayals had now reached its final stage. Marcus Serrano's network had already begun collapsing under the pressure of Adrian's countermeasures. Financial accounts connected to Serrano's logistics companies had been frozen. Several of his allies had abandoned their partnership, and intelligence reports confirmed that his remaining forces were gathering for one final confrontation. Serrano had nothing left to lose, and men with nothing left were always the most dangerous. Inside the operations room of the mansion, the final strategy meeting was underway. The digital maps covering the walls displayed the last remaining strongholds of Serrano's network along the eastern seaboard. Red markers showed warehouses, financial offices, and shipping terminals still under his control. Victor Calderon studied the map carefully. Most of his allies have disappeared, Victor said. But Serrano himself is still moving shipments through Baltimore. Adrian stood beside the map, calm and focused. He wants a final fight. Victor nodded. He believes if he can disrupt our eastern ports long enough, some of the investors who backed him will return. Adrian's voice remained quiet. They won't. Victor glanced toward Clara, who stood near the conference table reviewing the latest intelligence reports. Over the past weeks, Clara's role inside the mansion had changed dramatically. She was no longer simply Adrian's wife in name. Her insight into the financial systems connected to Serrano's conspiracy had made her one of the most valuable voices in the room. Adrian now listened carefully whenever she spoke, and Victor had quietly accepted that reality as well. Clara looked up from the reports. There's something else. Both men turned toward her. Clara pointed to a shipment schedule displayed on the screen. Serrano's last operation is moving through a private shipping terminal outside Baltimore tonight. Victor checked the coordinates. That terminal connects directly to his remaining financial accounts. Clara nodded. If he moves that shipment successfully, he can recover enough capital to rebuild his network. Adrian studied the information carefully. Then he gave a small nod. Then we ended tonight. The convoy of vehicles left the mansion shortly after sunset. The drive to Baltimore took several hours, but the tension inside the armored cars remained quiet and controlled. Adrian's security teams moved with practiced discipline. Everyone understood the importance of the mission. If Serrano escaped again, the war could drag on for years. The private shipping terminal stood near the edge of the harbor, hidden behind rows of rusted warehouses and abandoned industrial buildings. Floodlights illuminated the loading docks where several cargo containers waited to be transported. Serrano's men were already there. Adrian's convoy stopped several blocks away. Victor studied the security layout through binoculars. Approximately 20 guards. Adrian nodded. They're protecting the shipment. Victor lowered the binoculars. And Serrano? He's inside the warehouse. Adrian stepped out of the vehicle. His men followed quietly, moving into position around the perimeter of the dockyard. The confrontation unfolded quickly. Serrano's guards attempted to hold their ground when Adrian's security teams moved forward. But Serrano's empire had already begun collapsing. Without the financial backing and alliances he once relied on, his forces were smaller, weaker. Within minutes, the remaining resistance fell. The warehouse doors opened. Marcus Serrano stood inside, surrounded by the final pieces of the operation he had spent years rebuilding. His expression carried exhaustion rather than anger. You always find a way. Serrano said quietly when Adrian approached. Adrian remained calm. You made one mistake. Serrano tilted his head slightly. What was that? You underestimated the people who would stand beside me. Serrano glanced toward the open warehouse door where Clara stood beside Victor. Recognition appeared briefly in his eyes. The woman. Adrian did not respond, because the war had already ended. Without Serrano's leadership, the remaining pieces of the rival network collapsed completely. Within days, Adrian's empire regained control over the shipping route Serrano had attempted to seize. The financial systems connected to the conspiracy were dismantled. The investors who once supported Serrano quietly withdrew from the criminal world entirely. Peace returned to Adrian Varela's empire. But for Clara Bennett, the greatest change was still ahead. Several months later, the mansion overlooking the forest felt quieter than it had since the war began. Winter snow covered the trees beyond the estate, turning the landscape into a calm white horizon. Inside the private wing of the mansion, Clara lay resting in a softly lit room. The long months of tension, secrets, and conflict had finally reached their end. The child she had hidden for so long had finally arrived. Adrian stood beside the window, watching the falling snow, when Victor entered quietly. Victor's expression carried something rare. A smile. You should come see her. Adrian turned. For a man who had commanded armies of loyal followers and controlled powerful criminal networks for years, this moment felt strangely unfamiliar. He followed Victor down the quiet hallway. When Adrian entered the room, Clara looked up from the bed. The newborn child rested gently in her arms. For a moment, Adrian simply stood there. The sight felt almost unreal. The woman who had once entered his world as payment for a debt was now holding the future of his family. Clara watched his expression carefully. The man the world feared most looked almost uncertain. She smiled softly. You can come closer. Adrian stepped forward slowly. When he looked down at the child, something inside him shifted in a way he had never experienced before. Responsibility. Not the kind he carried for his empire. Something deeper. Something personal. Clara spoke quietly. She's your daughter. Adrian nodded slowly. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then he finally said something that surprised even himself. No one will ever touch her. Clara understood exactly what that meant. The promise was not just about protection. It was about the future. Adrian Varela had spent years building an empire through strategy and strength. But now, he had something even more powerful to protect. Months later, as spring returned to the forest surrounding the mansion, Clara often found herself standing on the balcony overlooking the quiet gardens below. The war had ended. Adrian's empire was stronger than ever, and the life she once believed had been stolen from her had transformed into something she never expected. Sometimes she thought back to the moment her father promised her to Adrian Varela. At the time, it felt like the destruction of everything she had hoped for. But as she watched Adrian walking through the gardens with her daughter in his arms, Clara finally understood the truth. The cruel Mafia boss she once feared had become the strongest protector she could ever have imagined, and the promise that once felt like a prison had quietly become the beginning of a destiny neither of them had ever expected.